Our first day began enthusiastically. We slapped our sunscreen and mosquito repellent and prepared ourselves for our first adventure. We were off to see the Genocide Museum, also known as S21, followed by the infamous killing fields. As soon as we arrived on the bus, I knew I hadn't prepared myself enough for the devastation that was S21. We arrived to rusted barbed wire fencing and an overwhelming realization that an estimated 17,000 prisoners were detained and tortured behind the very walls we were entering only 38 years later. Amongst the cells, there were images and facts demonstrating just how appallingly detainees were treated. It broke my heart to read of the different torture methods, but it truly devastated me to read of the general day-to-day treatment. I remember reading about the showers and hygiene standards. Showers generally consisted of a guard poking a hose through the window and spraying the many prisoners within the cell. Survivor Chum May received one shower every 2 months. Next, we travelled to the killing fields. The most chilling artefacts within the fields were the killing tree and the skulls. The killing tree is a thick-rooted tree covered in coloured bracelets where Khmer Rouge soldiers would execute small children. It was incredibly morbid to stand in front of the tree, as my mind's eye vividly reenacted the heinous acts every time I looked at it. After walking throughout the designated pathways surrounding the mass graves, we arrived at the commemorative glass shrine containing 8,000 skulls of the victims of the fields. I re-entered the bus feeling overwhelmingly devastated. I couldn't stop thinking about how recently the events had occurred, how most survivors of the Khmer Rouge period were still alive. It was an appropriate start to a long, heart-wrenching 3-week trip. Monday saw the start of our first formal sit-down meetings. We started the day walking up many stairs into the Friends International office. We would soon learn that most offices we attended turned into leg day. We learned of Friends International global fight to protect children. The offices in Phnom Penh and Siem Reap actively respond to harsh living conditions of homeless and working children. The goal is to give every child access to education and give every youth the skills required to secure stable employment. They provide support to at-risk groups, giving access to rehabilitation for drug users and sex workers. Most importantly, they run a program called the Child Safe Movement. Prior to attending this meeting, I had no idea that sex tourism was such a prominent issue in Cambodia. Child Safe strives to provide social support to children and to free them of the burdens of domestic violence, sex slavery, poverty, orphanages, addiction, and manual labour. I had heard of sex tourism in places like Philippines and Thailand, but I was blissfully ignorant of Cambodian orphanages and their repugnant treatment of children. ChildSafe provided us a flyer with 7 tips for travellers in Cambodia, promoting us to think. Children are not tourist attractions. After this meeting, I was hyper aware of my surroundings and noticed a lot of elderly men travelling, either alone or together in the city's heart. It was hard not to think negatively and judge their motives, but at least I was made aware of a real issue within the country. We visited the Cambodian Centre for Human Rights. This was the first NGO that really started to ignite my passion fire. We learned of the 4 projects they are currently working on. The Fundamental Freedom Monitoring Project, which aims to monitor the basic fundamental rights of Cambodians through polls, media and incident reporting. The Fair Trial Project, which increases the knowledge and understanding of the right to a fair trial throughout the public. The Civil Society Organisation Productivity Project, including capacity training. And finally, the Sexual Orientation and Gender Project, fighting for LGBTQ and women's rights in hopes of empowering them and providing legal support. After speaking with the staff, I had my first experience feeling wholeheartedly ashamed of the Australian government. One of the staff asked us openly why we thought Australia was sending refugees to Cambodia, a developing nation. As a group, we were unable to provide a logical answer, and I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the trip. We started Tuesday by attending the Anzac Dawn service at the Australian Embassy. This was incredibly important to me. It seemed only right that we pay our respects to the diggers who fought and earned our rights to the freedoms we enjoy, the freedoms that are devastatingly clear as we spent more time in the developing nation of Cambodia. We were fortunate enough to have met with Yuk Chang, the Executive Director of the Documentation Centre of Cambodia. He has played such a fundamental role in acknowledging and educating his nation and travellers about the Khmer Rouge travesty. Mr. Chang dedicates his time collecting photos and films relevant to the Khmer Rouge, writing manuals for other NGOs, and educating people how to properly handle evidence so as not to contaminate it and ruin its admissibility. The Centre has provided more than 600,000 documents as evidence to the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia to try the leaders of the Khmer Rouge. In speaking with us about the ECCC, Mr. Chang provided an invaluable perspective. He taught us to see that justice has more than one meaning. He explained that many of the provincial victims received their justice by signing a petition and having their voices heard. It was enough for them to have come to terms with what had happened and to move on. The process of the trials in the ECCC is more important than the subsequent judgment. When speaking of the Khmer Rouge, Mr. Chang said to us, "I look for beauty in the darkness." That really resonated with me. My whole life I have been morbidly fascinated by history, but it's not a fascination with blood or war, it's a fascination with people and how they respond to tragedy, how they regroup and regather. After lunch we travelled to the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, a court created especially to try the leaders of the Khmer Rouge. Here we learned fundamental basics of the Cambodian legal system. We first got to speak with the public affairs officials who explained to us some of the specific tragedies committed by the Khmer Rouge. Most notably for me, we learned of forced marriages with the objective of increasing the population and subsequently the power held. After speaking with the public affairs team, we spoke with members of the defence support team. Together they explained that a list is provided to the defendants, and with UN legal aid funding, they can apply for any of the lawyers on that list. We learned of the difficulties that arise in a civil law system where only the judge can investigate. Counsel must file an investigative request if they require further evidence. The prosecution have preliminary access to the investigation, and defence counsel are afforded no pre-trial preparation with their clients. Finally, we met the Chief Prosecutor Bill Smith, an Australian ex-police prosecutor and legal advisor and analyst for the International Criminal Tribunal. He was an incredibly intelligent and wise man who advised us of the different cases to be tried in the ECCC. In my legal mindset, I was left unsure of the whole process of the ECCC. It almost doesn't seem enough justice for the death of nearly 2 million people. But as a compassionate human, I am glad that the victims are given a platform to have their voices heard and are able to move on from such a devastating tragedy. Today was the first day Cambodia attacked my health. I spent the rest of the trip battling illness. Unfortunately, I missed the morning meeting today, and the rest of the team visited the University of Law and Economics. After lunch, I rejoined the group and we travelled to Action pour les Enfants, also known as APLE. They are an NGO dedicated to combating child-based sexual abuse by investigating and prosecuting child sex tourists. This was one of the 2 NGOs that really stuck with me and one of the organisations I wish to return to help. We were shown a short video of one of their successful cases, where a German pedophile had over 5 terabytes of child pornographic material that he had created whilst in Cambodia. The perpetrator was ultimately convicted to 25 years imprisonment. Prior to this meeting and prior to this trip, I was adamant that I was not going to practice as a lawyer. I left this meeting so inspired, so invigorated, and remembering why I started the degree in the first place. Prior to leaving the meeting, I had a discussion with one of the directors about returning to volunteer as a solicitor. It was the International Bridge to Justice where we actually felt the loss of the Australian development aid that was cut to fund the refugees deported to Cambodia. It is crucial for NGOs to maintain steady funding so they are able to provide the support to the community when the government is too corrupt to provide it itself. The fight to promote procedural fairness and protect the accused from cruel and unusual punishment and torture is a fight fought by the International Bridge to Justice with minimal funding. Of the 990 lawyers for Cambodia, only 75 complete work for legal aid. It is not allowed to go to court without a lawyer, as many detainees cannot afford a lawyer. They wait in Cambodian prisons for extensive periods of time to commence their proceedings. Many do not get transported from the prison to the court for their trial, and often do not know of their judgment or sentencing. This raises the question, why are so many people arrested if the prisons are already so overcrowded and it costs so much to detain someone? It is believed by Cambodian police that it's better to arrest someone innocent than to risk harm by allowing a guilty man on the street. Police often arrest more people so they are able to obtain a promotion for their hard work. I was starting to become familiar with the theme. There is no such thing as procedural fairness in Cambodia, and never had I appreciated administrative law more. Like most privileges we have, we take public accountability for granted too often in Australia. We were then privileged enough to sit witness to a translated client interview. We learned of a 17-year-old boy who was imprisoned for stealing a bicycle. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, though the time spent in custody awaiting his trial served as his sentence. The most astounding information I learned from the interview was that he wasn't informed of any of his legal rights or the court process until he arrived at his trial. Moreover, even after being released, the boy's lack of understanding of proceedings led him to believe that he was acquitted. As far as he understood, he was innocent because he didn't have to spend any more time in prison. Again, I couldn't help but appreciate procedural fairness and have a greater understanding of the luxuries we're afforded in Australia. We finished our first week with a highly emotional visit to Trapang Anchang village outside Phnom Penh. The village was built as a result of the railway project funded by AusAid and the Asian Development Bank. 220 families live in the village. Each was given a block of land but was responsible for the construction of their own house. After speaking with the village representative, we learned that education was too expensive for most families, so they didn't send their children to school. We walked around the village and tried to process the absolute poverty pushed on such a large number of people. All of the houses were ground level, which means that the houses will be severely prone to flooding for the duration of monsoon season. After many complaints to the Asian Development Bank, there still hasn't been any investigation or action following the poor living standards. For the first time in my life, I felt the burden of white privilege. Finally, to lead us into the weekend, we were afforded a touch of home and visited the Australian Embassy. We sat down for a talk with Naomi, the Senior Liaison Officer for the Australian Federal Police, and Lauren, the Head of Political Economy, Media and Diplomacy, to discuss Australia's relationship with Cambodia and the Australian cooperation in the fight to defeat child sex tourism. Throughout the meeting, I couldn't help but feel happy to be surrounded by Australian accents. After a full week of digesting content and fighting hard to understand Cambodian accents, my exhausted mind appreciated the small luxury.